3 stages of dog training. Now Alright, now the last thing that we need to focus on really when we come down to it is the 3 stages of dog training. Now this doesn't matter what you're teaching the dog, whether it be basic obedience, advanced obedience, detection work, nose work, tracking, trialing, whatever you want. You're going to break everything down into 3 levels. The first stage is the learning. This is elementary. Alright, sorry for my handwriting, but this is where there's a lot of fun. It's a lot of engagement. Learning is well attached to activity and emotion. So in elementary school, as people, we have a lot of recess time, we have a lot of song and dance, a lot of drawing, a lot of playing, but not a whole lot of learning. And most of what we are learning is being taught to us through activity and emotion. We are learning through a subconscious level. At this point in our age, we don't know how to learn. So we're actually learning on how to learn. Then we move up to like the middle school area. Usually, middle school. Usually by the time you're in middle school, you have a lunch break, and that's pretty much it. You don't have recesses anymore. By then, your day is filled with sitting in your chair, reading, and taking notes. So now you understand the learning process. You are expected a higher level, but there's a lot more leniency than whenever you're in high school. When you're in high school, you're expected to do the work. You're expected not to be micromanaged all the time, and you're expected to understand the process of how school works. So in the learning phase, elementary school, we're learning how to learn. This is where I like to call, there's 2 ways to do this, and that's either shaping. And shaping has a more profound effect on the dog. Same thing with us. If something you figure out on your own or you teach yourself on your own, it's going to stick with you more solid than if somebody kind of molded you and forced you to learn it. You can still retain the knowledge, but this will have a more profound effect on you, but oftentimes it will take you the longest. So I'm trying to learn how to crochet, okay? If I'm trying to learn on my own, I'm trying to watch videos and all this, and I'm struggling. If I figure it out on my own, it's going to stick. I'm going to say, I learned how to do this on my own. It made sense to me. I created that behavior in myself, my own way. Or I could have somebody sit down and teach it to me. Now, while it sometimes might be more frustrating, they can sit down and teach it to me. I'll learn faster, but it won't have that same end result effect. I can still, at the end, still crochet, but will it stick with me better by shaping or luring? So shaping is, molding it. With dogs, if you want the dog to sit, you'd simply sit around and wait till the dog sat on its own. You'd mark and you'd reward. The dog would go, okay, what did I just do to get that reward? To say, well, I did this and nothing happens. So, well, I did this, nothing happens. But then they sit down, we mark a reward. The dog goes, oh, I figured this out on my own. They want to sit. Shaping is also done through approximation. So say if there's something bigger, you want the dog to jump up on something, for example. The dog comes up, it puts its front paws on the bench or whatever. You mark and you reward. The dog goes, oh, okay, cool, next up there. And it doesn't get a mark and reward. He goes, But now it kind of crawls up a little bit more and it stands on the bench seat. You mark and you reward. The dog goes, oh, okay, that's what you wanted me to do. And then the dog jumps up there, but you don't get a mark and reward. So now the dog goes on top of the picnic table bench itself, you mark and you reward. And that's the final thing you wanted the dog to learn. But it taught itself how to do it through approximation. So it really depends on how you see shaping, and people have different explanations, but that's mine. And then we also have luring. Now luring, like if you imagine you have a fish hook and you have a lure on there, obviously, if you have a fish, the whole thing is to lure that fish to the hook. The entire premise of the lure is to look appealing to the fish, to bring it in, to bite the hook so you catch a fish, right? Well, luring is the same thing. We have dog food or whatever, and that's what we always start with. We have a treat, and we simply move the dog into a sit position, we click and reward. We move the dog into a sit position, we mark and reward. Eventually the dog knows that the act of sitting receives the reward. So in learning, we're also creating positions. Okay? So in the learning stage, we teach them the fundamentals of what we're wanting. That this is narcotics detection or something like that. This would be luring the dog to the odor or luring the dog into the indication position. And then we mark a reward. So I prefer luring positions in the learning phase. So luring is learning. Okay? Once the dog is doing all the positions, sit, down, stand, coming in to heel through luring, and is doing it easily and consistently, then we can move to the next step, which is understanding. This is where we're going to put it on command. We're putting it on verbal cue. So once they have learned the position, they need to understand what that position is. In middle school, they need to understand what study really is. So in here, now we would lure them into a sit, and we would say, yes, reward and everything, but then we'd say, sit, lure, mark and reward. Sit, lure, mark and reward. And through classically conditioning, once again, the verbal of sit means nothing to the dog, but it knows the behavior. So now we say sit, and the dog anticipates the lure. We say sit, the dog sits, we mark a reward, the dog goes, oh, you don't have to lure me, I just have to listen for that word. And then bam, you have that understanding. The last stage, once the dog is and consistently doing the command, when we say it, we're going to start proofing it. Proofing is when we start adding corrections and punishment. Okay? So the dog has learned what the behavior is. It understands the command for that behavior. Now it needs to understand and learn that it must do that behavior every time it's commanded, and we do that through corrections and punishment. So learning is luring, understanding is commanding, and proofing is punishing. Okay? This is where we're in high school, we start acting up, we get sent to detention a lot more. I have a little bit of knowledge in that area as well. So let's look at how we can use operant conditioning to aid this. In learning, it's mostly positive reinforcement. We are luring, marking, rewarding through positive reinforcement because we are creating positions, we are creating behavior. I'll also move into negative reinforcement. If luring is not working totally, then we can start using negative reinforcement, which is that pressure on and off. Now what I will do is I will add these together at some point. So the dog is going into position, great. If it's not, I can add negative reinforcement. And I can also use an e-collar, the vibrate function, or low stimulation as well. So now I can say the dog lure sits, lure sits, lure sits. Now it understands or it's learned this. I can say sit, vibrate. The dog sits, I release, and I can say yes, then reward. So the dog gets reinforced on the stopping of the vibrate, but then it also gets a positive reinforcement. So I'm doubling up on teaching it that behavior. it has a bigger effect on the dog's mental capability. So sometimes I will use this in the beginning stage if the dog is not luring. If the dog is just not interested in food, I can use force through on and off pressure. If not, I can just tie this in with understanding. I will also at this point add in the understanding area, negative punishment. So now the dog knows what the position is. I say sit, the dog anticipates the vibrate, it sits, great. If it doesn't, then I can say nuh-uh and walk away. The dog goes, man, I really should have sat. And then I come back and I say sit. The dog sits, and then I go back to positive reinforcement. So in understanding, I'm adding the verbal cue. If it doesn't listen to the verbal cue, I will start adding negative punishment. It's starting to learn reprimand, such as in middle school is when we start getting introduced to the idea of detention. Nothing serious, nothing big, but it's there. So I can now use all of these in conjunction. But everything ties back to positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, lure, mark and reward. Then we start adding verbal cues with pressure, and then we mark and reward. The dog disobeys, but then it obeys, we reinforce. So reinforcing and punishing the disobedience. And then in the proofing is where we start using positive punishment. The dog now learns it must obey at all times. And we classically condition this dog to know. So now, we've done this for weeks and months. We're not rushing this in a few days, people. So it's not like we're teaching the dog and then blast them with an e-collar. This will take weeks. This can take weeks. This can take weeks. Depending on the dog, this can take months just to get to here. Okay? Now, if you're really good at what you do, you can kind of expedite some of these. But you'll see how we do it in our videos coming up. So in proofing, we add the positive punishment. We use e-collars primarily because, remember that little story I told you about how they took, a lot of dogs did tests on their stress hormones? They actually learned that e-collars gave off less stress than withholding the reward or prong collars. So if you think about that, that means that withholding the reward was more stressful, more punishing, and more abusive to the dog than receiving e-collar stimulation. So that's why we like to use that here, because we're introducing the idea of punishment, but it has a more profound effect. And then in proofing, we can gauge the level. Once again, all dogs are working dogs, the Premack principle, balancing reward and work, balancing punishment and disobedience. And now in the proofing stage, if the dog doesn't listen, we can give it a small correction. If the dog does a very large bad behavior, we can match that behavior with a correction. So, another thing I also like to incorporate is, say, if I tell the dog to sit, the dog does not sit. I say, nuh-uh, I turn around, I come back and I say, sit. The dog doesn't sit, and I say, nuh-uh. I come back and I say, sit, vibrate, the dog sits, I release, I reward. Or if I come back and say, sit, that I vibrate, the dog still doesn't sit, I amp it up and give it an actual correction, it might sit. Now, when it sits, I can go back to rewarding. So in that situation, we can be using the e-collar and proofing for pretty much all of this. So everything compounds on top of each other, and we cover the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning through the 3 levels of education, or 3 levels of training. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense to you guys, and it's starting to kind of all fall together. That it's very important to condition our dogs, classically condition verbal markers, so we can create a training language that can coincide with the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning, that coincides with the Premack principle that we use to balance our 3 training levels. So kind of a lot of information there, but if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and comment below. I'll try to answer them. But hopefully this makes some sense to you. And as we start watching videos of dogs starting their training, you'll understand it just a little